This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. A big thanks goes out to Michael Holzman, author of Spies and Traitors, Kim Philby, James Angleton, and the Friendship and Betrayal that would shape MI6, the CIA, and the Cold War. Links to learn more about Michael Holzman and his books can be found in the show notes. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies, and stories so great they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or just send me an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you'd like to support Beyond the Big Screen, I would really appreciate it if you left a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think about the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. You can also tell a friend, share on social media. Anything is appreciated and it's all really helpful. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. Thanks for joining us again today. I am very excited to be joined by our special guest, Michael Holzman, author of the book Spies and Traitors, Kim Philby, James Angleton, and the Friendship and Betrayal that would shape MI6, the CIA, and the Cold War. Michael Holzman is author of numerous books, including James Jesus Angleton, The CIA and the Craft of Intelligence, a biography of Guy Burgess, and one of Donald and Melinda McLean, as well as the novel Pax, 1934 to 1941. I think before we even get started, what got you interested in writing about spycraft, and in particular, this time period in the intelligence services?
I came to this through an interest in James Angleton, actually. The situation that he was in when he was an undergraduate at Yale was one in which there had been a decision, I'm not quite sure whether this was conscious or not, to change the way that elite students were educated so that they were removed from the atmosphere at the time. This is the late 1930s of more or less Marxist thought in universities, and put in a position where they were on the opposite end of the political spectrum. And it occurred to me that this would be a good test case to see whether that kind of educational indoctrination, that kind of education, had the effect that was anticipated. As the Jesuits had said that if they had a child to the age of 7, they would answer for the rest of their lives. Was Yale saying that if we had a young man, in this case, to the age of 20, would they answer for his political opinions for the rest of his life? So Angleton had this elite education, and he then went into the American Foreign Intelligence Service, which at that time was called the USS. And I tried to trace his thoughts and his actions to see if this was the case. In doing so, I became very interested in him and his family, and also in foreign intelligence. This led then to Kim Philby.
I think that that's so fascinating. And it was something that came to my mind when I was reading the book is James Angleton's education and background. He was born not exactly into the wealthy class as such, but his family eventually did become very wealthy. And other people like Wild Bill Donovan, he married into sort of the aristocracy, and then the George H.W. Bush was involved in intelligence, and Kim Philby was sort of in that class. And there's other people. William F. Buckley was involved for a certain time in intelligence. Was this all coming from the sort of this experiment you talked about and this kind of class of people?
I think that one could argue that until maybe the 1970s, maybe later than that, the purpose of Anglo-American Foreign Intelligence Services was to preserve the class interests of the people that you're talking about. They were recruited from a very narrow stratum of American and British society. And they were pretty much overtly dedicated to preserving the interests of that group. We'll see with Philby, he was brought into MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, on the basis of the fact that the people who were in charge of MI6 knew his father. They said, oh, we knew his people, so we figured he'd be a good guy. And that was this group we're talking about. It was pretty much the same with Angleton. His father went into OSS at the beginning of the Second World War. And when Angleton was drafted into the army, he used his influence to pull James Angleton out of the infantry and into the intelligence service. The early CIA was dominated by people that you're talking about, by Dulles, for example, and Wiesner and so on, who went to the right schools and knew the right people and married the right women. And that continued to be the case for a remarkably long period of time. There's a story about Wiesner, Frank Wiesner was the person who founded the tradition of the CIA going to foreign countries and overthrowing the governments, where one day his secretary opened his desk drawer and pulled out a pile of checks. He hadn't cashed his salary for a year, and she handed these to him and said, go buy yourself a car. So that's the kind of socioeconomic group that we're talking about.
And James Angleton's father, he was a high leader in the National Cash Register Company. And I think like nowadays we think of a cash register that is just a ho-hum kind of thing, but really wasn't that high tech back then.
Yeah, that was NCR, the National Cash Register Corporation, was the high technology company of its time. And the senior Angleton not only sold these, the legend is carrying them on the backs of mules through Idaho and Montana before the First World War, but part of his job was instructing people on how to use them because they were not used to using machines at all. He was a really very good salesman. He went from mule-back sales of cash registers in Idaho to being vice president for sales for the entire corporation at its headquarters in Dayton, Ohio. Then on an inspection tour of the European branches of the National Cash Register Company, he went to Italy and he thought, oh, well, here's an opportunity for a go-getting kind of guy to do much better with the business and to make money on his own. So he bought it. He bought the Italian branch of NCR and moved the family in the early 1930s to Milan, where they lived in a palazzo in downtown Milan, which was a far cry from the kind of log cabin or worse upbringing that he had had. As a result, the James Angleton, everybody in that time was called James Angleton, which is very confusing. The James Angleton were interested in started school in Boise, began secondary school in Dayton, and then was, I guess, privately tutored in Milan for a while and sent to a private school in Britain, where he finished his secondary education. And when he went to Yale, he looked like, to his friends, to his colleagues and teachers, he seemed to be an Englishman. He had British clothes and manners and a slight British accent. That was that background.
Now, Kim Philby, a lot of his background is reminiscent, at least of James Angleton, the one we're speaking of. What was Kim Philby's background?
Kim Philby was a child of the Empire. His father was an extremely interesting person who had been born in Ceylon, if memory serves, went to private schools in England. The tradition was that the children would be sent away from their parents, away from India or Ceylon, to live in England for their youth. Went to private schools there. Then he went to Cambridge University. And he took the exam for the Indian Civil Service, which was a very rigorous exam at that time. We're talking about maybe 1910 here. Many languages and including horseback riding. He scored well. He went back to India and then became an administrator. The British governed India with three institutions. One was the government of India, which consisted of people like St. John Philby, and there were very few of those, maybe 7,000 or something. The other organization was the Indian Army, which was quite large, nearly 100,000 people, many of whom were native Indians under British officers. And the third organization was the Indian Intelligence Service. And the Indian Intelligence Service was, in effect, a secret police. And this was how they controlled this vast continent. The key literary monument of the Indian Intelligence Service is the novel Kim by Kipling. And since Kim, the hero of that novel, was seen as a very positive person, that's how Kim Philby got his nickname. He was actually Harold H.A.R. Philby. His father, St. John Philby, as he rose up through the Indian Civil Service, got a reputation for being the kind of guy that you would give a difficult assignment to, but he really wasn't someone you wanted to have at the club. He had his own ideas, so was very critical of authority. But he rose well. And when the First World War started, the Indian government, the British Imperial government of India, invaded the Ottoman Empire. They invaded what is now Iraq. And after some misadventures, they conquered it. St. John Philby became one of the two or three highest ranking people in effect, the British occupation of Iraq. He did that for a while, then he got into one of these personality conflicts that he got into all through his life. And they said, look here, why don't you go to Arabia and see what's going on there as a delegate of the Indian Empire? So he went off into Arabia and he met Ibn Saud, who was one of the two chieftains who were fighting for dominance in the Arabian Peninsula. He became Saud's advisor and remained so for decades. The other chieftain, was Hussein, and Hussein's advisor was T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. So St. John Philby and T.E. Lawrence weren't in conflict, they were together. They were both agents of the empire, trying to detach the Arab populations of the Middle East from the Ottomans. St. John Philby drifted closer and closer to Ibn Saud and further away from the British government. At one point, he, as a delegate of the British government, he set up what is now Jordan, including the Arab Legion, the army there. But eventually he decided it would be better to have his life in Arabia. And he set out on a series of explorations of the Arabian Peninsula. He was the first European to go across the peninsula. And he did establish a pattern of going on these lengthy, very risky expeditions, returning to London where he would write a book about it, go on a lecture tour, get some money, and then return to Arabia. He was very famous in the 1920s and early 1930s for doing this sort of thing. Now, his son, Kim, followed the same pattern initially. He went to the same private school and then he went to Cambridge. But it was the early 1930s. And at Cambridge, he became part of a group of young men who were very concerned about the economic state of Britain. And he joined the Communist Party, along with Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, the famous later spies.
And Kim Philby, I mean, in a lot of ways, Kim Philby is connected to almost every bit of history and current events of the entire 20th century going into the 21st century through his father and the split between the House of Hussein and the Saud, which is really everything in the Middle East, even up until today. And then the playing out of the Cold War. It's amazing how somebody is so central to so many different things that happened in both history and current events.
Yeah, that is true. Part of the reason for this was the extremely narrow British ruling class. Up until the 1970s, only 2% of the British population went to the university. And it was much narrower when Kim Philby and his father went through in the early 20th century. And as the British Empire ruled India through the secret police of the Indian intelligence service, so they attempted to remain dominant through the two others, MI5, which was in charge of the empire other than India, and MI6, which was the British Secret Intelligence Service for the rest of the world. Kim Philby eventually became one of the top people in MI6. And as that, he had relationships with all the other intelligence services in the world, unless they were at war. So he was instrumental in forming the CIA itself. All these people knew each other, they went to parties together, and they drank together.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. The British, they were almost light years ahead of the Americans on intelligence. And like you said, with so much of the things they were doing in India, where they were essentially a secret police, is it fair to say that the Americans were really far behind the game going into the 30s and then eventually World War II?
The United States didn't have a foreign intelligence service. It had the FBI, which was very active inside the United States. But the Secretary of War, Stimson, said that gentlemen do not read one another's mail, and dissolved what had been an intelligence service in the First World War. When it became apparent that the United States was going into the Second World War, Donovan, who you mentioned, went to Roosevelt and said, we need to have something like the Brits have. And Roosevelt said, sure, go do that, as Roosevelt did with many things. So they set up this organization, the OSS, and they thought, now, what do? We don't know how to do this stuff. So they put a major office in London and used it as a training site for their people. When James Hugh Angleton brought his son, James Jesus Angleton, into OSS, James Angleton the younger was sent to London to learn how to be an intelligence officer. The person who was in charge of training this American group that had come over, particularly in counterintelligence, how do you keep your own intelligence apparatus from being infiltrated by the enemy, was Kim Philby. So James Angleton became a student of Kim Philby's, and they had good times in London in the 1942, 43, 44 period. And James Angleton was a very good student. He learned how to be a counterintelligence officer from Kim Philby, whom he was working for. He was then sent out to Italy, which was gradually being conquered by the British and American armies, very, very slowly, to manage the counterintelligence effort there. The idea was that there were a lot of Nazi secret agents left behind as the battle lines moved north. And then there were the indigenous fascist intelligence people. And these had to be rooted out and identified and taken care of. James Angleton started with a very small remit to do this, and eventually ended up being in charge of U.S. counterintelligence for all of Italy by 1945. All through this, whenever he needed help, he would contact Kim Philby. Kim Philby would tell him, well, in this situation, the best thing to do is that. Philby's role was so important that when Truman dissolved OSS at the end of the war, the officers in the counterintelligence unit who wished to have it continue turned to Philby for advice on how to structure it and how to pitch, as it were, their argument to the American government to maintain a counterintelligence capacity. Philby, at the end of the war, survived the purges that follow and was made head of the MI6 anti-Soviet effort, which must have amused people in Moscow. Actually, in Moscow, they couldn't believe it. They thought it was amazing that their agent was head of the British effort to counter the Soviet KGB. He then continued to rise, and he was appointed in the late 1940s to be the British intelligence coordinator for all of their intelligence units in Washington, D.C., to have liaison between British intelligence and the American intelligence units, which at that point was something like what became the CIA, but also the FBI, and interestingly, the Atomic Energy Commission's intelligence operations. That put him, as you said, at the center of all these efforts.
To me, it was absolutely just mind-blowing how somebody somebody like Kim Philby could become so central to everything. Was there any hint to, I mean, it's easy to see in hindsight to see how compromised he was, but even reading the book, it sure seemed like he had a record of being a quote unquote red. How did somebody just keep going along like he did and going higher and higher and higher into these echelons and able to spread his tentacles into so many different areas of intelligence when he didn't have the squeakiest of backgrounds?
No one checked. The first layer of protection he had was when he was entering the communist world in the 1930s. He was told that he should sheep dip, as the CIA would have said later, change the way he was perceived. So he told everybody he was no longer a communist, he was a fascist. He joined the Anglo-German Fellowship, which was the Nazi organization in London in the early 1930s. He wrote a bit for their newsletter. Then he got a job as a stringer for the London Times. And he did this because his father met the editor of the Times at their club and said, "My boy needs a job. Do you have anything for him to do?" And the editor said, "Oh, yeah, there's a civil war going on in Spain, and we need someone to cover the nationalists, the rebels." So Philby went out to Spain, and first was just a stringer, but later became a correspondent for the London Times. And his articles, along with those of one other fellow, were the way that the Brits, the British public that read the Times, learned about Franco and the war against the Spanish Republic. And Philby's articles weren't explicitly propaganda for the fascists, but they were quite matter of fact. And this is a perfectly reasonable thing that's going on here. So, in the course of that assignment, he was in a situation where a artillery shell hit a car he was in with a number of other correspondents. He wasn't wounded. One of them was killed. A couple were wounded. And as a result of that, and because it was an interesting propaganda thing, Franco gave him a medal. So that medal from Franco testified to Philby's political bona fides, as far as the Brits were concerned. After the Spanish Civil War was over and the fascists had won, Philby goes back to London. He's sent to France with the British Expeditionary Force. He has to leave France because of Dunkirk, And at that point, he gets picked up through a series of ephemeral organizations into the British intelligence world. At no time did anybody look at his record until much, much later on, because it wasn't the practice to do so. The practice was to say, do we know his people? And if they knew his people, that was enough.
What were some of the biggest operations that Philby was involved with in gathering information for the Soviet Union? What were maybe some of the biggest ones that were the most harmful to the British and the Americans?
Well, the famous operation, there were a lot. The famous operations were about Albania and Poland very early on in the post-war period. And here we're talking about the late 1940s. People like Frank Wiesner, who I mentioned earlier, wanted to roll back the Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. The person most emphatically in favor of doing this was Winston Churchill, who had been trying to do it since 1917. They looked around in the post-World War II period and said, well, the weakest point is Albania. And it had just developed a communist government, and Albania was not a strong state. They recruited many Albanian refugees. They formed this exile army. And the idea was they would send these troops into Albania and overthrow the communist government. As the units were landed in Albania, either by boat or by parachute, they were all met by the Albanian secret police and shot on the spot, or tried and shot after that. It's likely that one way that the Albanian secret police learned about this was through Philby's reports to Moscow, which were then relayed to Albania. There were other possibilities, but that is a likely road. Poland was this big story. The Soviet occupation in Poland developed this scheme where they informed through secret channels, they informed the British and American intelligence services and governments that there was a secret army in Poland, that this was fighting against the Red Army, that's the Soviets, and all it needed was some money and some arms, and it would overthrow the new communist regime in Poland. So the United States and Britain supplied money and arms in vast quantities. It turned out that there was no secret army, that the money and arms were going to the communist government of Poland, which was quite grateful for them. And it's probable that Philby had a hand in that. There was also this ongoing high level of activity in Germany, where it seems that the mainstays of the German economy after the Second World War, until the economic miracle kicked in, was spying. Everybody seemed to be a spy on one side or the other, and it was a good way of getting an income. Many of the Western spies were captured by the German Democratic Republic secret police, the Stasi, and its colleagues. And it's probable that that word was passed by Philby. A particularly spectacular thing is that after Philby had left Lebanon, which I presume we'll get to, and was in Moscow, he wrote a book, autobiography, My Silent War. And the appendix to that, he lists every British and American intelligence officer he had ever met, with their names, their duties, and an appreciation of them. Hundreds, which meant that none of those people could continue in their careers. They had all been blown, as they say. This was very damaging to those intelligence services. I think we need to penetrate some of the legends here, the legends that have been promulgated by CIA, MI6, and so forth. The primary work that Philby did for the Soviet Union was against the Anglo-American intelligence services. It was very much a spy versus spy conflict. What he didn't affect the larger international relationship, and had no effect on the people in the street. It mostly affected the other intelligence services. That would get one into an interesting discussion of the value of intelligence services.
Yeah, that is an interesting aspect of this, is that so much of it was very high level and compartmentalized into the intelligence services. What do you think were the impacts of some of these things, of these counterintelligence moves that Philby and others were involved in, that did have more of a wider effect?
The spectacular example, I think, was from Angleton. Angleton came from a social anti-Semitic background, as they say. He was a disciple of Ezra Pound, who was a notable anti-Semite. But while he was in Italy, Angleton was in Italy for the OSS. He came in contact with a group of people who were forming what would become the Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, and he became their patron. He actually spent a lot of time dealing with other intelligence services and getting control over them. In any case, he became the patron of the Mossad and reversed and became very pro-Israel. Let's say he used to go on vacation in Israel. In the 1950s, he had suspected a British scientist named Mon of being a Soviet agent, or at least a communist sympathizer, and had turned him and said, well, look, I'm not going to blow the whistle on you. You're going to work for us. But when the Israelis decided that they needed a nuclear weapon, they called Angleton and they said, we need some help on building this breeder reactor. Can you help us? And Angleton said, oh, I've got this guy. So he sent this guy to Israel. And the story is that the development of the Israeli nuclear force was helped a great deal by this move. And I'd say that's a fairly important effect of intelligence services.
Maybe to wrap up Philby, how was Philby ultimately smoked out from the intelligence services, and finding out that he really was so deep and at such a high level, but he was a direct Russian agent?
It's complicated, and I'm not sure that the stories that we know are true. In any case, the story is that his college friend, Donald MacLean, was a very high-ranking British diplomat and had been in Washington during the Second World War, was a key person in the development of the atomic bomb, the alliance between the British and American governments to develop the atomic bomb. After the war, the British and American cryptographers were able to break into the Soviet codes, and they found these messages from the United States to Moscow, but from the Soviet agents, saying we've got this guy who can tell us everything that's going on. And they included information that revealed that it was Donald MacLean. The effort to get MacLean ran through the British embassy in Washington in the late 1940s. The code room was controlled by Kim Philby. So Kim Philby knew that his friend was about to be blown. As it happened, Philby had a boarder in his basement who was Guy Burgess, another one of their college friends. Philby said to Burgess, the communications are unsafe. What you should do is you go to London and tell Donald that things are hot. He has to leave. Burgess did this. The Soviets took MacLean to Moscow, and while they were at it, and it's not clear why they did this, they took Burgess too. So back in Washington, people said, this guy was in your basement. He's a communist spy. What are you doing? And so the Brits called Philby back to London, and they said, we can't prove you're a spy, but obviously you can't continue to work with us. And they fired him. He couldn't quite get on his feet there was a period of a few years when things were difficult. And then his old friends in MI6 said, he's one of us, we know his people, this thing. And they got him a job as a foreign correspondent for The Observer and The Economist in Beirut, where he went, and his father had retired to Beirut. And so Philby were in good shape. Meanwhile, Angleton had spent all this time, we're talking about 1959, had spent all this time trying to figure out what had happened to him. How had he been betrayed in this way by a person he thought of not only as his teacher, but as his friend? And he decided he was going to get Philby. He sent people to Beirut and said to them, you find out some way to get him. Part of this was they put pressure on the Brits. The Brits sent somebody out from London. They sent one of his old friends. And they said, look, we know you're a spy. If you confess, we won't shoot you. And he said, sign this confession. The Brits moved a couple of days before Angleton's people did. So Philby said to his old friend in MI6, sure, I'll sign that. I'll sign it in the morning. And in the morning, he was on a ship on his way to Russia.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. As far as if any of these services had the opportunity, would they have actually eliminated him if they could have?
Yes. They both have records of doing this. There was a document release from the CIA some years ago in connection with the investigation of the Kennedy assassination. Angleton had been the CIA's liaison to the Warren Commission, saying that, we didn't do it. You can trust us. In any case, after many lawsuits, the CIA did a data dump of 10,000 pages, maybe more than that, of information associated with the Kennedy assassination investigations. And this is just on the internet. It's just there. There's a couple of problems with it. One is that it's not organized in any way. It's 10,000 random pages, and only someone doing research on the book on Angleton and Philby would read these. In any case, it wasn't only the Kennedy assassination in the records. It looked to me like someone had just backed up a dump truck to Langley, the CIA headquarters, filled it with all the documents that were nearby, and then taken it off. Among these were contracts for assassination. The Central Intelligence Agency, like all intelligence agencies, is a bureaucracy. And when they want to have an agent do something, they give them a contract. And so there's a series of documents, there's a random collection of documents that have to do with the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And they show, do we have a good assassin? Oh, yeah, this guy's a good assassin, so we'll give him another contract to do this. How is he going to do it? Well, he needs a rifle. Well, we'll have to get a special kind of assassin's rifle, and there's a contract to get that. And then there's the CIA wasn't squeamish about assassinating people. And I'm sure that your listeners know all about the efforts to assassinate Castro, which went on and on and on. And Castro only survived because the Cuban intelligence service is better than the American intelligence service, or it was at that time. I'd say that they probably wanted to capture Philby and have him confess and do in reverse what he later did. They'd have him confess, and he would name all the Soviet agents and satellite agents that he knew, which would be very valuable for them. But I think if push came to shove, they would shoot him.
I think that this is such a great story because it prompts so many more questions than you read a page and I had question after question. And one question that kept coming up in my mind, what sort of reckoning was there in these intelligence services after such gigantic failures like with Kim Philby? Were these, it sure doesn't seem like these agencies were gutted. How did people's careers survive through this? who were people were so tainted, even people just by contact, you think that their careers would be destroyed.
Well, in the British case, some people were forced out. Some people got early retirement. But generally what happened was that the career was damaged. You didn't go quite as high in the hierarchy as you thought you would. And that was it, because, they knew their people. We know your people. We're not going to hurt you too much. In the United States, people were retired. I guess the strongest thing that happened was there developed, this didn't have to do with Philby. There developed a fight within the CIA between Angleton and the operations people like Wiesner, not Wiesner himself. Angleton's job as head of counterintelligence was to prevent the CIA from being infiltrated. So he got control over the process by which, when an agent was hired, he had to say, that guy's okay. And he was reluctant to say that guy's okay, because you never know. And as he had learned from Philby, it could be anybody. It could be your best friend. The operations people got very angry about this, and they said, well, look, you're stopping the entire effort. It takes us months and months to get past you in order to get someone certified, and by then the opportunity is gone. It's like working for human resources in a big company. Angleton maintained his position and his power as long as the original people who set up the CIA, Alan Dulles and Richard Helms and so forth, were in place, because they were tight. Eventually, the director of the CIA was this guy, William Colby, who wasn't part of that group. He was an operator. Colby became director and fired Angleton. He not only fired Angleton, he dissolved the entire counterintelligence staff of the CIA. So I think that was a major consequence of these things. The result of that, of course, was Aldrich James, that although there had been no one that we know of, who had infiltrated the CIA while Angleton was in charge of counterintelligence, when he was gone, you had this person who, as the cartoon depicted him, had a sign on his desk saying Spysky, and then probably others after that. So I think that was a consequence of these internal struggles.
Do you think with so many, there's so many different people, like you mentioned Aldrich Ames and the McLeans and Burgess and Philby, maybe particularly with Philby, do you think that he wound up working for the Soviets and really pushing their agenda? Because do you think he was a true believer? Do you think that he thought that they were ultimately going to win? Did that evolve over time, his real motivations?
I think we have three layers here. His father was a critic of the British Empire. He thought that the empire had done the Arabs down, and he was very pro-Arab. Now, he converted to Islam and so forth. So that was an influence. Philby was very influenced by his father. The second thing is, I think, although I'm not a psychiatrist, that Philby was a sociopath, and that he liked betraying people. He liked saying, I'm your friend, while stabbing them in the back. Very charming person, which is a characteristic of sociopaths. And the third thing to your question is, he was a true believer. He was a communist. When he was in Moscow after leaving Beirut, he married, I think it was his third wife, who was an American. And she went with him to Moscow after a delay. And while there, she said, if you had to choose between me and the Communist Party, which would you choose? And he said, well, the Communist Party, of course. That marriage didn't last long after that. So I think he was a true believer. I think all those people were true believers. Donald McLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt was kind of cared about art. The situation that they were in when they were young was that Britain was a country that was run by 2% of the population for its benefit. the miners and other people on welfare and unemployment had so little support from the state that many of the men stayed in bed all day because they didn't have enough food to have the energy to go out. This is described in George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier. So first one, humane instincts, looking at the situation that they saw when they were in college, would say, well, this system is not good. Something has to be done to change it. Some of those people became socialists. Some of them became fascists. Some of them became Labour Party apparatchiks. And some of them became communists. Some of them became overt communists, going to rallies and so forth. And some of them, like Philby and Burgess and McLean, became secret communists, working at first for what they thought of as working for peace, and later, and for the Comintern, the Communist International. It was only later that they realized they were working for Stalin. But by then it was too late.
Do we know much about what Philby was thinking in his later life? He died in 1987, so fairly close to the fall of communism, and people by the late 80s knew things were rocky in communism. Do we know anything of what he thought about that, and if he reflected at all on his life choices?
Philby was enclosed in the secret intelligence world from the 1930s. When he was in Moscow, he was in their secret intelligence world. And here there are a couple of factors. One is he was a very severe alcoholic, and the KGB spent a lot of time trying to dry him out and failed to do that. So they decided just to give him maintenance, one bottle of vodka a day, not two. He became a trainer for their spies. He would give classes on how you fade into life in England so that people don't spot you as a Russian. So I don't think he thought much about anything about the system, except technically, whether the KGB was operating well or not. Donald Maclean was a much more interesting person. Maclean had reached a very high level in the Foreign Office and had spent his life as a Foreign Office official. When he went to Moscow, first they had to dry him out, and he had to kind of recover. And he became a Soviet official, a Soviet think tank guy. He was head of the think tank unit that looked at British foreign policy, and attempted to interpret that for the Soviet Foreign Office. He got very high in the hierarchy, and he became critical of the way in which the Soviet hierarchy had fossilized in the Brezhnev years, and supported the refuseniks and the critics of the regime. And since he had so much prestige, he was able, in certain moments, to intervene in favor of them. His criticism of the regime, this is before Gorbachev, was from the point of view of a true believer in communism. He was criticizing the Soviet Union as having lost its ideals. So he had this broader view. Philby was simply locked into the secret intelligence world.
Another question that I had that I think was fascinating is used so many primary source quotations from primary source documents. What was your process for researching it, especially combing through that data dump of tens of thousands of documents? I mean, that must have been an intense process.
Yeah. Those are on the internet, and you can just page through them. I'd be asked what I did for what I had been doing today, and I said I've been reading these documents. That went on and on and on. So there are those. Then there are two primary archives. There's the National Archive outside Washington, D.C., which has American documents. One of the directors of the CIA, when he was about to retire, had been in OSS. And he used his authority as director of the CIA to declassify the entire OSS archive. So you can go to the National Archives and read day by day everything that was done by the OSS in the Second World War. Then there's the British National Archives in London, a place called Kew, where you can go and there it is. Memoranda from one person to another, speculations. There was kind of a thrilling moment when I was trying to find this information about what St. John Philby had done in Arabia, and they brought me this very big portfolio, 18 inches by 10 inches, and a couple inches thick. And it was the collected official memoranda having to do with the British Empire's effort to take over Arabia. And in this were routine kind of bureaucratic documents. We've had this meeting, this person said this, what are we going to do next? Some of them were from St. John Philby, and some of them were from T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, who was, one more security bureaucrat at that time. And that was kind of exciting. I did a few interviews when I started this, and I discovered that the closer the person was to the information I needed, the more likely it was that they would lie to me. I could figure this out, but I thought, why do I spend time figuring out why these people have given me information that isn't true? I mean, that seemed to be a complete waste of time. But I did some of that. And then there are other archives in other places. So you do that kind of research. As time goes on, the documents that had been stamped top secret are no longer top secret. And so you're able to get that kind of insight.
Do you think through your research, are there still pieces of information out there that are still top secret that you'd love to get your hands on to?
Yes. I'm doing research now on a project I call the Anglo-American Cold War, which is how the United States took over the British Empire after the end of the Second World War. One aspect of that was the atomic bomb project. As you probably know, the idea of the atomic bomb was developed in England. They figured out, German scientists who were refugees in England figured out how to make an atomic bomb. And they went pretty far with this, but they ran out of money in effect. And the project was transferred to the United States, where we have the Manhattan Project. After the Trinity explosion and then Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the American Army, which was managing it, said, oh, well, the Brits are foreigners, so we won't tell them anything. And the Brits who felt they needed an atomic bomb had to make this enormous investment in order to develop their own project. A few years ago, every file in the British National Archives that had to do with atomic energy was withdrawn from the archives and sent to a place called John O'Groats, which is the British equivalent of Nome, Alaska, or something like that. And they said, if you want to read this, you can come up there and apply, and we may let you read it. So no one has seen these things. And I'd like to see those. The intelligence files, which are extensive, have also been heavily weeded. There is lots and lots of stuff that's missing from the files. You'll ask for a file about John Smith in 1942, and they'll say, "Oh, sure," and you'll get this file folder that says John Smith 1942. You open it up, and there's nothing in it. So there's lots of stuff to learn about these things.
To wrap up today, in this little battle of a huge Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States and the West, who do you think really came out ahead in the counterintelligence battle of the Cold War?
Well, this isn't exactly my field. My understanding is the Cold War ended because the Soviet Union went bankrupt because of the arms race, and that it really had nothing at all to do with this enormous expenditure on all sides in intelligence. The crucial intelligence coup in that period was that of Klaus Fuchs, who was one of these German refugee scientists in Britain who was at Los Alamos and told the Soviets which way to go to produce an atom bomb. But in general, I don't think that the intelligence effort of the CIA or MI6 or the KGB mattered a great deal. If you talk to a State Department official, a foreign official, and you say, how valuable is information from the CIA for your work? They'll say it's not valuable at all, that it's just cocktail party chatter, and that you can get much better information through normal foreign office kind of research.
Yeah, it really does seem that in the end, it's almost just a game, a deadly game of cat and mouse, but they do all these things to go back and forth and back and forth. But then in the end, I mean, in some of these cases, there were big coups, but those things may have happened anyways without all of the back and forth.
Yeah. There's kind of a last testament of James Angleton, which I think is very indicative this way. He had lung cancer, and as he was dying of the lung cancer, he had an interview with a correspondent, and Angleton said, the CIA got tens of thousands of brave people killed. We played with lives as if we owned them. We gave false hope. I so misjudged what happened. Fundamentally, the founding fathers of U.S. intelligence were liars. The only thing they had in common was a desire for absolute power. I did things that I regret, but I was part of it and loved being in it. Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, Carmel Alfie, and Frank Wiesner were the grand masters. If you were in a room with them, you were in a room full of people that you had to believe would deservedly end up in hell. Angleton slowly sipped his tea and then said, I guess I will see them there soon.